It was a Sunday morning like any other. The church was filled with the usual hum of activity, the soft murmurs of parishioners greeting each other, the shuffle of feet as people found their seats, the scent of polished pews and fresh coffee lingering in the air. But for Pastor Michael Harris, today was different. Today was going to change everything. Little did he know, his whole world was about to be turned upside down. Pastor Harris had been the head of his church for over 20 years, known for his passionate sermons and unwavering belief in traditional values. He was a man of God, a figure who commanded respect in his community, a man who stood firmly against things he deemed unholy. He had always preached about the sanctity of marriage, about the natural order of things. He had been clear in his beliefs. Homosexuality was a sin, a temptation that people had to fight against if they wanted to live a righteous life, and for years his convictions had been his shield, his guiding compass. But all of that was about to come crashing down. As he prepared for his sermon that morning, Pastor Harris was oblivious to the storm brewing at home. His son Jake, a young man in his early 20s, had been struggling with a secret so deep, so personal, that it felt like a weight on his chest every single day. Jake had always admired his father. He had always tried to live up to his expectations, to be the son that Pastor Harris had dreamed of. But there was something inside Jake that had been growing stronger and harder to ignore over the years, a truth he could no longer bury. Jake was gay. It wasn't something he had chosen, it wasn't something he had asked for, but it was who he was, and it was becoming impossible to keep hidden any longer. The feelings, the thoughts, the undeniable truth, it had all reached a point where Jake could no longer pretend. He could no longer lie to himself, and he could no longer lie to his father. The weight of the decision to tell his father the truth was almost unbearable. Jake had watched his father from a distance for years, seeing the way he preached, the way he condemned what he believed to be wrong. And Jake had been terrified of rejection, terrified of losing the one person he had always looked up to. But the time had come. He couldn't keep pretending, not when the person he loved most was the one he feared would never understand. As Pastor Harris stood before his congregation, delivering his sermon, Jake was at home, pacing back and forth, struggling with his own internal battle. He could hear the faint hum of the church service through the closed windows, knowing that in a few hours his father would return home, and he would have to face him. His heart raced with every step he took, each thought about how he would begin the conversation. How could he even start? How could he find the courage to say the words that might shatter the bond between them? Pastor Harris had always been a man of conviction. He had always prided himself on his ability to stand firm in his beliefs. He didn't just preach about sin, he lived by what he preached. He had raised Jake with these same values, with the belief that to live a righteous life meant adhering to certain principles. So when Jake walked through that door later that evening, it wasn't just a conversation, it was a collision of two worlds. Jake stood in the doorway, nervously wringing his hands. He had always been his father's pride and joy, always the obedient son, the one who followed the rules, the one who was destined to carry on his father's legacy. But now, in this moment, everything he had known felt like it was falling apart. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "Jake," Pastor Harris said as he noticed his son's tense posture, "what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat tighten. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and yet nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. His father, the man who had always been his rock, the man whose opinion he had always held in the highest regard, was about to hear something that might tear their relationship apart. "Dad," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Pastor Harris looked up from his Bible, his expression softening. "What's on your mind, son?" For a moment, Jake hesitated. How could he say it? How could he find the words to explain something that felt so foreign to the man he loved so much? But in that moment, something clicked inside him. He realized that if he was going to live his life authentically, he had to be honest. He had to stop hiding. "Dad," he repeated, his voice steadier this time, "I'm gay." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything they represented. Pastor Harris froze, his face draining of color. It was as if the world had stopped turning. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The room felt suffocating. His son, the one he had raised, the one he had prayed over, had just told him something that contradicted everything he had ever believed. For a long moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that could only come from a moment of complete disbelief, the kind of silence that made time feel like it was standing still. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he waited for his father to speak. What would he say? Would he reject him? Would he disown him? The fear was palpable, and Jake's whole body shook as he stood there, waiting for the storm to break. Pastor Harris blinked a few times, trying to process what he had just heard. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and anger. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze. "I'm gay. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's who I am, and I can't hide it anymore." For the first time in years, Pastor Harris felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: doubt. His world, the one he had carefully constructed around his beliefs, was now crumbling in front of him. The son he had raised, the boy he had envisioned would carry on his legacy, was standing before him, a stranger in some ways, yet still his son. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Pastor Harris wanted to speak, wanted to say something, anything to make sense of this, but the words wouldn't come. He was drowning in confusion, in fear, in anger. He had always been so sure of what was right, what was wrong. But now the lines were blurred, and he didn't know how to navigate this new reality. Jake's heart sank as he watched his father struggle. He knew the man he loved so much was torn between his love for him and his deeply held beliefs. It was a battle that neither of them could win without sacrifices, and in that moment, Jake realized something that would haunt him for years to come. The truth he had shared had not just changed his life, it had changed his father's life too. As the evening wore on, the conversation was far from over. What happened next would shock both of them in ways they never expected. And the future? Well, that was uncertain. Would Pastor Harris be able to reconcile his faith with his love for his son? Or would this revelation forever separate them? Pastor Harris sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the words Jake had just spoken still hanging in the air like an invisible fog. He could hear the tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner, but it was drowned out by the deafening silence between them. Jake stood across from him, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure if his father was even processing what he had just said. It wasn't just the shock, it wasn't just the confusion, it was the deep-rooted disbelief that something so fundamental to his worldview was now being questioned. Pastor Harris had dedicated his life to serving God and spreading what he believed to be the absolute truth. He had built his entire existence around his faith, and that faith had always told him that there was only one way to live a righteous life. Homosexuality to him was an abomination, something that had to be rejected in order to live in alignment with the teachings of the Bible. And now his son, the person he had raised and loved since birth, had just revealed that he was gay. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The sense of control he had always maintained was slipping away. He had never imagined that the one thing he had held most dear, the love of his family, would be challenged in such a way. Jake was waiting for a response, but the silence dragged on, thick with uncertainty. The tension between them was palpable. He could feel his father's eyes on him, but they didn't seem to hold the same warmth they once had. Instead, there was a flicker of something that Jake couldn't quite place, a mixture of anger, confusion, and fear. He couldn't blame his father for being shocked, but part of him felt the sting of that silence. He had opened up, had poured out the truth he had carried for so long, and now he was left hanging, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. "Dad," Jake finally said, his voice cracking with emotion, "please say something." Pastor Harris took a deep breath and stood up, pacing slowly across the room. His hands were shaking, and for a moment, Jake thought he might burst into anger. But there was no shouting, no yelling, just the slow, methodical steps of a man trying to find his footing in a situation that felt completely foreign to him. "I don't know what to say, Jake," Pastor Harris replied, his voice hoarse. "I've always taught you to follow the word of God, to live a life that pleases Him. And this is not what I taught you. This is not what I raised you to be." His words were heavy, burdened with years of belief and tradition. Jake felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had expected shock, maybe even anger, but hearing his father's voice quiver with uncertainty and disappointment was harder than he had imagined. His father had always been his guiding light, his moral compass. To see him questioning everything, to see that disappointment in his eyes, felt like a personal failure. "I never wanted to disappoint you, Dad," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "But this is who I am. I didn't choose this. It's not a phase. It's not something I can change. And I'm not asking you to accept it all at once. I need you to understand that I'm still me. I'm still your son." Pastor Harris stopped pacing and turned to face him. His eyes were bloodshot, his brow furrowed in deep thought. The room felt colder somehow, as if the very air had shifted. "How am I supposed to understand, Jake? How am I supposed to reconcile this with everything I've taught you, everything I've built my life around?" Jake could see the turmoil in his father's face. It was as if the foundation of his entire belief system had just cracked wide open, and he had no idea how to rebuild it. Jake's heart broke for him, but at the same time, he felt a sense of urgency. He couldn't go back. He couldn't undo what he had said, and he didn't want to. He had spent years hiding, pretending, and the weight of that had nearly crushed him. He had to live his truth, no matter the cost. "I don't know, Dad," Jake said quietly, "but I'm not asking you to change your beliefs overnight. I just want you to see me. I want you to see the person I am, and not the label you've attached to me." Pastor Harris closed his eyes, as though trying to gather his thoughts, trying to sort through the mess that had been created. For a long time he said nothing, and Jake began to wonder if he would ever say anything at all. It felt like the clock was ticking, every second slipping away in silence, and with each passing moment, the gap between them seemed to widen. Finally, Pastor Harris spoke again, his voice much softer than before. "I've spent my life preaching to others, telling them what's right and what's wrong. I've been so sure of myself, of my faith. But now, I don't know. You're my son, Jake. I love you. I just don't know how to handle this. It feels like I've been blind all these years. I've been preaching to others, but now I feel like I don't even understand my own child." Jake's eyes welled with tears, but he held them back. "Dad, I understand. I really do. This isn't easy for you. But please don't shut me out." For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of Pastor Harris' heavy breathing. Then he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to move forward from here. I don't know what this means for us, for our relationship. I've always believed that living a righteous life meant rejecting this. I don't know if I can change that. I don't know if I can ever fully accept this." Jake felt his heart sink. The words stung, but they weren't a surprise. He had feared this reaction. He had feared that the love his father had always shown him might not be enough to overcome his beliefs. The distance between them felt insurmountable, and for a moment, Jake wondered if this was the end of their bond. Would his father ever accept him for who he truly was? Would he ever look past his anger and confusion to see the son he had raised? "Dad," Jake said, his voice trembling, "I'm still your son. I'm still here. I'm not asking you to accept everything right now. I just need you to hear me, please." Pastor Harris didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping as he ran a hand through his hair. Jake stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The room felt impossibly still, the silence so thick it felt suffocating. Would this conversation ever reach a resolution? Would they ever find common ground? And as Pastor Harris remained motionless, the question lingered in the air, unanswered. How could you love someone when everything you believed in was suddenly called into question? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Pastor Harris stood in the corner, his back turned to Jake, his hands gripping the edge of the mantle as if he needed something to steady himself. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him, the unsaid words hanging like a dark cloud between them. He had hoped for some sort of breakthrough, for his father to take a breath and look at him, not with judgment, but with the understanding of a parent who had seen his child struggle and grow. Instead, the distance between them seemed to widen with every passing second. Jake glanced at the clock on the wall. It had barely been an hour since he had come out to his father, but it felt like an eternity. What had he expected? Was this truly the best he could hope for? A father who didn't even know how to react. He had imagined every scenario in his head, from anger to rejection to silence. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't hatred in his father's eyes, but it wasn't love either. It was confusion, fear, and a helplessness that made Jake's chest tighten. The truth hung in the air like a wound neither of them knew how to heal. Jake, I don't know what to say, Pastor Harris muttered, his voice low, as though confessing his own struggle. This changes everything. I've spent my life preaching about the sanctity of marriage, about the order of God's creation. And now, here you are, my own son. Jake flinched at the mention of God's creation. That had been the hardest part. He had always thought of himself as part of that order, as someone who was simply trying to live a good life. But now he felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, a square in a world that demanded circles. He had tried for so long to be who his father wanted him to be, and now it felt like nothing he said would ever be enough to bridge the gap between them. I know this isn't easy for you, Jake said, his voice trembling but determined. But it's who I am. I can't change that. I'm still the same person I've always been, Dad. I still love you. I still want to be your son. But I need you to see me, not this idea of who you think I am. Pastor Harris took a deep breath, his hands still gripping the mantle as he let out a long sigh. I'm not sure I can just forget everything I believed. I don't know how to reconcile this, Jake. This isn't just about you being my son. This is about everything I've ever taught, everything I've ever stood for. If I accept this, if I accept you, it feels like I'm betraying everything I've worked for. Jake's heart sank at the words, but he understood. Pastor Harris wasn't just struggling with the idea of having a gay son. He was wrestling with his entire identity as a pastor, as a man who had spent years preaching a certain doctrine. The very fabric of his life felt torn in two, and Jake was the one standing in the middle, forcing him to face something he had spent his life avoiding. I'm not asking you to change everything you believe, Jake said, his voice softening. I'm just asking for a little understanding. I don't need you to agree with everything. I just need you to see me. The silence between them deepened, thick with the tension of unspoken words. It felt like Jake's heart was being pulled in two directions, toward the man who had raised him, and toward a truth that could tear them apart. How could they move forward from here? Was there even a path that didn't lead to heartbreak? Pastor Harris finally turned, his face a mixture of anguish and confusion. His eyes searched his son's face, trying to make sense of the words, trying to find something he could hold onto in the midst of the chaos. I spent so much time teaching others how to live righteous lives, but now, Jake, I don't even know how to be a father to you, Pastor Harris said, his voice strained. How do I accept something like this without compromising everything I believe? Without questioning my own faith? It's not just about you. It's about the world I've built for myself and the man I've become. Jake's throat tightened. He could see the fear in his father's eyes. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about the church. This was about a man who had lived his life by a set of principles that had suddenly been called into question, and he didn't know how to handle it. It was easier for him to condemn the world around him than to face the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world he had built was wrong in this one crucial aspect. Jake had always seen his father as a strong, unshakable figure, But now he realized how fragile that strength was. Pastor Harris wasn't just afraid for his son's future, he was afraid for his own. The realization hit Jake hard. His father's world was crumbling, and he was the reason. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the weight of that responsibility. "I don't want to lose you, Dad," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I can't lose myself either. I can't keep pretending to be something I'm not just to make you happy. This is who I am. I love you, and I always will, but I need to be honest with you. I need to live my truth." Pastor Harris' eyes filled with tears, his jaw clenched as though fighting the wave of emotions crashing over him. He had never wanted this for his son. He had never imagined his family would be torn apart in this way. His faith, his convictions, had always been a rock he could cling to. But now, that rock was slipping through his fingers, and he was helpless to stop it. The silence stretched on again, but this time it wasn't as suffocating. Both men were trying to make sense of the situation, trying to find some way to bridge the gap between love and belief. They were standing on opposite sides of an impossible divide, both reaching out but unsure how to cross the chasm that separated them. In that moment, Jake realized something important. This wasn't just about his coming out. This was about his father's journey too. Pastor Harris wasn't just struggling with his son's identity, he was grappling with his own. The conflict was deeper than Jake had imagined, and the path forward wasn't as simple as just accepting the truth. It was about reconciling years of teaching, faith, and identity. And for both of them, the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. "What if I can't change, Jake?" Pastor Harris finally said, his voice broken. "What if I can't accept you for who you are?" Jake closed his eyes for a moment, his own heart aching. "Then we'll figure it out, Dad, one step at a time. But I can't be who you want me to be. I can only be who I am." And as the conversation lingered, both father and son stood on the precipice of something neither of them fully understood. Their worlds were colliding, and neither of them knew what would come next. Would they find a way to heal the rift, or would this truth drive them apart forever? The future seemed as uncertain as ever, and the tension between them was now more than just a conflict. It was the beginning of something that would test them both in ways they could never have expected. The room felt suffocating now. Every breath seemed to carry the weight of the world, and Jake could feel the tension in his chest growing tighter. His father stood still, his gaze distant, as though he were trying to process the magnitude of the situation. The space between them seemed to stretch, each passing second deepening the divide that now existed in their relationship. Jake's heart pounded with a mix of fear and longing, desperate for his father to understand, to see him as he truly was. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was unbearable. Jake shifted on his feet, watching his father carefully, unsure of what to do next. Pastor Harris had yet to make eye contact again. The only movement was the occasional tremor in his hands, and the way his body seemed to slump lower with each breath. Jake felt a knot of sorrow twist in his stomach. He had expected many things: anger, confusion, disappointment, but this deep, gut-wrenching silence was the hardest thing to bear. "Dad," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please don't turn away from me." His father's eyes flicked toward him for a brief moment, and in that fleeting glance, Jake could see the exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that came from years of struggling to reconcile his own beliefs with the overwhelming weight of his love for his son. Pastor Harris opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His eyes looked glassy, distant, as if he were lost in a storm of thoughts that he couldn't articulate. The minutes seemed to drag on, and Jake found himself replaying their conversation in his mind. Had he said the wrong thing? Had he pushed too hard? He tried to hold on to the hope that his father might eventually come to accept him for who he was, but the fear of losing him, of never bridging the gap, gnawed at him. He knew this moment was a turning point for both of them, but he had no idea which direction they would go. Finally, Pastor Harris spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to fix this, Jake. I don't know if I can. I spent my life teaching people that this way of life, this way of thinking, is the only right one. How do I go on, knowing that my son, my flesh and blood, is living in a way I cannot comprehend? Jake's throat tightened at his father's words. It wasn't anger anymore, or even disappointment. It was an overwhelming sense of confusion, mixed with something deeper, more painful. It was fear. Fear that his faith, his entire purpose in life, might not hold up in the face of this truth. Pastor Harris had devoted so much of his life to preaching a gospel that didn't seem to have room for this new reality, this truth about his son. And now, standing in front of him, was the very person he had always loved, yet who felt like an insurmountable contradiction to everything he had believed. Jake didn't know what to say. How could he explain something that had never seemed wrong to him? He had never chosen to be gay. It had never been a decision. It was simply who he was, and who he had always been. He didn't want to make his father feel as if he had to choose between his faith and his son, but he also couldn't stand the thought of living in the shadows any longer. He couldn't hide the truth any more than he could hide the love he had for his father. "Dad," Jake said, his voice quivering, "this isn't about you or your faith failing. It's about me. I need you to see me. Not the person you thought I was, but who I really am." Pastor Harris' face hardened for a moment, the old resistance resurfacing. "You don't understand, Jake. I can't just see you. I have to reckon with everything I've believed, everything I've taught. And if I accept this, if I accept you for who you are, then what does that say about everything I've preached? What does that say about the church, about God's will? Can you even imagine how that feels? To have your entire life questioned like this?" The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had imagined many outcomes, but not this. A father who was so caught up in his own turmoil that he could barely see the pain in his son's eyes. Pastor Harris wasn't angry anymore, and he wasn't even rejecting him directly. He was lost in his own crisis of faith, torn between the man who had raised him and the reality that he was now facing. Jake swallowed hard, trying to find the strength to keep pushing forward. "I can't change who I am, Dad. I can't live in hiding anymore. I'm not asking you to give up your faith. But I can't be ashamed of myself. I need you to see that I'm not broken. I'm not lost. I'm just trying to live the life I was given." For a moment, the tension in the room felt suffocating. It was as though time itself had stopped. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, reminding them both that time was passing, that they were running out of it. But still, Pastor Harris stood in place, unmoving. Jake felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. What more could he say? What more could he do? He had bared his soul, but the chasm between them remained. "I can't do this, Jake," Pastor Harris whispered, the words coming out like a confession. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know if I can ever fully accept you the way you are. I don't know if I can keep being the man I've always been and still be your father." The words cut deeper than Jake had ever expected. His eyes filled with tears, but he fought to keep them back. He knew his father was in turmoil, but that didn't change the fact that he was standing on the edge of something painful and irreversible. Could he live with this? With the thought that he might never fully have his father's acceptance? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. What would happen next? Would the love they had for each other be enough to survive this trial? Or would this moment, this painful fracture, be the beginning of the end for their relationship? As the tension continued to rise, both father and son were trapped in a moment of uncertainty, each wondering if they would ever find a way to bridge the chasm between them, or if their worlds had finally collided in a way that would leave them forever changed. The night stretched on, each second dragging with the weight of unspoken truths. Neither of them knew how much longer they could stand this. Neither of them knew what the future would hold. But the one thing they did know was that just as the silence seemed to be suffocating them both, a knock at the door shattered the tension. It was unexpected, sharp, and made both of them jump, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene. Pastor Harris looked up, his expression momentarily confused, as though he had forgotten there was anyone else outside of this moment. Jake, too, was startled, his breath catching in his throat. For a brief second, he wondered if maybe the knock was some kind of sign, a sign that the world outside their home still existed, that reality was forcing its way back into their fragile bubble of confusion and heartbreak. Pastor Harris hesitated, glancing toward Jake before turning toward the door. Who could that be? His voice was barely a whisper, a mixture of frustration and wariness. He moved toward the door with slow, deliberate steps, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the knob. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. The only sounds were the distant hum of a car passing by outside and the muted beating of Jake's heart in his chest. When the door swung open, neither father nor son could have predicted what came next. Standing on the doorstep was a man Jake hadn't seen in years, his older brother, Luke. It took Jake a moment to fully process the sight. Luke, who had left the family home to go to college across the country, had been distant ever since. The last time they'd spoken, their relationship had been strained. There had been no real reason for the distance, just the ebb and flow of life and time. But now there he was, standing in the doorway like some kind of ghost from the past. Luke. Jake's voice cracked as he spoke his brother's name, surprise flooding his system. Luke's eyes flickered between Pastor Harris and Jake, a strange tension hanging in the air. His expression was unreadable, nothing like the carefree young man who had once shared laughs with Jake, or the quiet but protective older brother he had once looked up to. Instead, Luke looked troubled. His shoulders were stiff, his eyes distant as if he were carrying a burden of his own. But there was something else, something Jake couldn't quite place. Luke's gaze finally settled on their father. "Dad," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I think we need to talk." Jake looked at his father, who had grown even paler in the span of just a few seconds. The tension in the room had shifted once again, this time to something sharper, more unsettling. Pastor Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood frozen, as though the sight of his eldest son at the doorstep had knocked the wind out of him. It wasn't just the arrival of Luke that made the air thick with uncertainty. It was the way Luke had said those words, the way he seemed to understand everything without needing to say it outright. Something was wrong, and Jake could feel it like a cold draft on the back of his neck. Luke stepped inside, looking at Jake and then at his father, his eyes searching for something, maybe an answer, maybe forgiveness. But Pastor Harris wasn't giving him any. The room felt smaller now, as if their small house had somehow shrunk, and the walls were closing in on them all. "We've been keeping something from you," Luke continued, his voice heavier than it had ever been before, "and I don't think we can keep it hidden any longer." Jake's pulse quickened, his mind raced, trying to put together the puzzle. What could Luke possibly be talking about? What secret could they have been hiding all this time? Before Pastor Harris could respond, Luke turned his gaze to Jake. "I know what's been going on with you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "And I know what you've been struggling with. But there's something else you need to know, something about me." Jake blinked, his stomach twisting in a way he didn't understand. Luke wasn't making sense. What did he mean by something about me? What was happening? Pastor Harris' voice finally broke the silence. "What are you talking about, Luke?" he demanded, the confusion and fear evident in his tone. "What is it that you're trying to tell us?" Luke took a deep breath, his eyes flickering toward the floor, as though he were gathering strength to say something that was impossible to admit. "I've been keeping something from all of you for a long time, something I should have said years ago." He paused, as though weighing his words, before meeting his father's eyes again. "I'm gay too." Jake's mind went blank. He didn't know how to react, didn't know what to say. Luke's admission hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him speechless. For a moment, it felt as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. His brother, the person who had always been there for him, The person who had always seemed so strong was hiding the same truth that Jake had just shared with their father. Pastor Harris stood motionless, his face draining of color. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. It was as though the earth had shifted beneath him, and he was struggling to find his footing. This wasn't what he had expected. Jake's coming out had already shattered everything he knew, but now his oldest son, the one who had always been his pride, was revealing the same truth. Luke's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with the weight of their implications. Jake turned to his father, his mind still spinning. How could this be happening? His world felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't catch up. For a long, painful moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension between them all crackled, thick and heavy. Pastor Harris stood there, his eyes searching Luke's face, struggling to understand what this meant for his family, for everything he had worked for. "I don't know how to process this," Pastor Harris finally whispered, his voice almost broken. "I don't know what this means. For you, for me, for all of us." Jake's heart sank, and he couldn't help but feel the sting of those words. Was this it? Was this the breaking point? Was this the final fracture that would drive his family apart? The room felt colder now. They were all standing on the edge of a cliff, each of them staring into the abyss of the unknown. The stakes had been raised in a way none of them could have anticipated. What had started as Jake's personal revelation now seemed to be unearthing something much larger, something that none of them were prepared for. The clock continued ticking, and with each passing second, the tension grew. With this new truth,
be the one that tore them all apart, or was there still a chance for healing? Would Pastor Harris find a way to reconcile his beliefs with the love he had for his children? Or was this the end of the road? Everything they had known seemed uncertain now, and the only thing that was clear was that this moment would change everything forever. Hang was about to change. How exactly was still a question neither of them had an answer to. Pastor Harris' voice broke the heavy silence, his words coming out slower, as though each one carried a weight he had never anticipated. I don't know what to say," he whispered, looking from Luke to Jake and back again, his face a mixture of confusion, shock, and disbelief. His hands trembled at his sides, unsure of what to do. He had always prided himself on being the leader, the strong one, the one with the answers. But now, faced with the truth of his two sons standing in front of him, he felt more lost than he ever had in his life. Jake watched his father's face closely, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but part of him wanted to hear something reassuring, something that might give him a glimmer of hope that they could move past this. But deep down, he feared that this moment would be the breaking point, the moment that shattered everything they had known. Luke stood beside him, his gaze steady but tinged with something unreadable. He had taken a deep breath before speaking, and now there was a quiet confidence in his posture, as if he had finally said what had been buried deep inside him for so long. He wasn't running away from the truth anymore. He was standing there, vulnerable but strong. Jake knew the burden Luke had carried all these years. But somehow, seeing his brother stand tall next to him in this moment of reckoning made Jake feel a little less alone. "I know this is a lot," Luke finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "But we're still your children. We still love you, and we want to figure out how to move forward together. It's not easy, but we're here, and we just need you to see us for who we are." Jake looked at his father, waiting for any sign that his words were sinking in. The room felt charged, the air thick with unspoken tension. Pastor Harris swallowed hard, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked down at the floor as though searching for something in the patterns of the old rug beneath his feet. Jake held his breath, waiting. Then Pastor Harris did something neither Jake nor Luke had expected. He walked slowly over to the window, his back turned toward them. His voice was quieter when he spoke again, but it carried a deep, raw honesty. I spent my whole life preaching about sin. I've told so many people that this isn't right, that it's not part of God's plan. He paused, and his voice cracked. But now I'm looking at my sons, my flesh and blood, and I can't deny what's in front of me. Jake's chest tightened as he took a tentative step forward. He wanted to say something, anything, to reassure his father, to help him understand. But before he could speak, Pastor Harris turned back toward them, his face a mask of vulnerability and sorrow. I don't know if I can reconcile everything I'd believed with what's happening here, he said softly, but what I do know is this. I love you both, and no matter what, I can't lose that. The words hit Jake like a wave crashing over him. For the first time, he saw something in his father's eyes that he had been waiting for, a flicker of understanding, an admission of the struggle within him. It wasn't the acceptance Jake had been hoping for, not yet, but it was the first step. We've always loved you, Luke added quietly, his voice more vulnerable now than it had been moments before. And no matter what, we're still a family. For a moment, there was quiet. The air felt a little less suffocating, the weight of years of silence and fear starting to lift, ever so slightly. Pastor Harris' eyes met Luke's, then Jake's. And in that look, there was something that neither of them had expected, perhaps not even Pastor Harris himself. There was a willingness to try, a small but significant crack in the wall that had been built so high for so long. But just as the room began to feel like it was finally breathing again, a phone rang, slicing through the fragile tension. Pastor Harris' hand twitched toward his pocket, but he didn't answer right away. Jake could see the hesitation, the uncertainty on his father's face. It was as if he knew that this phone call was going to add another layer of complexity to everything. Finally, after a moment's pause, he answered it. Hello. His voice was quieter now, more guarded, as if he was bracing for whatever news might come next. Jake and Luke exchanged a glance, both sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold. Pastor Harris' eyes flickered, his body stiffening slightly as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. His face grew pale, and Jake felt a jolt of unease. Whatever it was, it had clearly shaken his father. Are you sure? Pastor Harris asked, his voice trembling. Is there any mistake? No, I need to see it for myself. Jake's heart raced again, his eyes narrowing in confusion. What could possibly be so shocking on the other end of that phone call? Pastor Harris hung up abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he processed whatever had just been said. I need to go, he said quickly, his voice strained. I need to go right now. Jake and Luke both looked at each other, alarmed. What's going on? Luke asked. Dad, what's happening? But Pastor Harris didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door, his mind clearly somewhere else. There was something urgent in his movements, something that made the room feel charged with uncertainty again. I'll explain later, Pastor Harris said, his voice tense, almost robotic now. Just stay here, please." Before either of them could protest, he was gone, leaving Jake and Luke standing in the silence once again. The phone call, the way it had made their father so shaken, left Jake with a sinking feeling in his stomach. What could possibly be so urgent? And how could it possibly complicate everything that had just happened? They stood there, exchanging looks once again, but this time the uncertainty felt even deeper. They had reached a fragile point of connection, but it seemed that fate wasn't done testing their family. Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the end, not yet. Something else, something bigger, was about to unfold. As the minutes ticked by, their father's absence hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over the fragile hope they had built. Was this the beginning of a new chapter for their family? Or was it another twist in the story that would bring everything back to the brink of collapse? The answer, Jake realized, was still out of reach, leaving them all hanging in the balance. The minutes dragged by in an oppressive silence. Jake and Luke remained in the same room, both uncertain of what to say or do next. Their father's sudden departure left a void, the kind that felt as if the foundation of everything they had just started to rebuild was crumbling again. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in a way that none of them could control. What was so urgent? What had their father been told that made him leave in such a hurry? Luke, ever the quiet one, broke the silence. "I didn't expect this," he said, his voice low. He was still processing everything, his own admission, their father's reaction, and the strange urgency that had taken him away without explanation. "It's like we finally reached some kind of turning point, and now this." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "Yeah, it feels like we were so close to something, you know? Like maybe he was finally starting to understand." Luke didn't respond right away, but Jake could see his brother's eyes narrowing as though he, too, was lost in thought. Neither of them could predict what would happen next, and they both knew that their father's sudden departure had only added another layer of uncertainty. Just as Jake was about to voice his own worries, the door opened with a slow creak. Pastor Harris stepped back into the room, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. His eyes flickered between the two of them, but there was a weight in his gaze now, something more than just the shock they had seen before. There was something new, something darker. "I have to tell you both something," Pastor Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "What I just found out, it changes everything." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been bracing himself for more tension, more confusion, but this was different. He could see the torment in his father's eyes. This wasn't about anger or shame anymore. It was deeper, more complicated. Whatever had been said on the other end of that phone call had opened a door, and the consequences were now impossible to ignore. "I don't even know how to explain this," Pastor Harris continued, struggling to find the right words. "But I need you to understand something. I've always believed in what I preach, in the teachings of the church, and it's always been so clear to me. But then I got that call. Someone from the church reached out to me, and they said they'd found something. A letter. A letter that's been kept secret for years. One that changes everything I thought I knew." Jake's stomach tightened. The air in the room felt colder now, the walls pressing in around them. "What kind of letter?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Pastor Harris looked away for a moment, as though gathering himself. "It's from my father," he said quietly. "Your grandfather." The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of Jake. His grandfather, the same man who had always been a pillar of their family's beliefs, the one who had shaped Pastor Harris' entire worldview, had kept a secret so monumental that it could change everything they thought they knew about their family's history. Jake could hardly believe it. "Your grandfather wasn't who I thought he was," Pastor Harris said, his voice cracking as he spoke. "He kept something from all of us. A truth. He wasn't just a devout man of faith. He was hiding something, something that he couldn't reconcile with the teachings he so strongly believed in. He had his own struggles, his own battles that he couldn't bring himself to face. And in that letter, he wrote about the shame and the pain of it all." Jake's mind was spinning. What does this have to do with us? Pastor Harris' eyes flickered with a sadness that was hard to place. He wrote about someone in the family, someone he loved dearly, but someone who wasn't accepted by the church, by the community. Someone he couldn't openly love because of what he believed was right. Someone who was gay. And in that letter, he confessed that he had turned his back on that person. Jake's chest tightened, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "You mean someone in our family? Someone your father?" Pastor Harris nodded slowly, the grief evident in his face. "Yes. He had a brother, my uncle. He was gay, and my father never accepted him for who he was. He pushed him away, ignored him, and allowed the shame of it all to fester in the family. And that secret, my father's secret, it's been haunting me. It's why I've been so hard on you, Jake. I thought I was doing the right thing by pushing away what I couldn't understand, by hiding behind what I had been taught. But now, seeing you and Luke, and reading that letter, I see how wrong I was." The room fell quiet again, the weight of Pastor Harris' confession hanging in the air. Jake felt a flood of emotions rush through him. Anger, confusion, a strange sense of understanding, but mostly a deep sadness for the history his father had carried with him all this time. For years, Pastor Harris had been bound by a lie, by a shame that had trickled down through generations. Now, as he stood before his sons, there was an openness that hadn't existed before. Luke spoke first, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not your fault, Dad. What happened with your father, what he chose to do, it's not your burden to carry anymore. We've been living in the shadow of your pain, and it's time for all of us to move forward. The shame isn't ours to bear." Jake felt a weight lift from his chest as he heard his brother speak. For so long, they had both been waiting for their father to truly see them, to let go of the past and embrace the reality of who they were. And now, finally, Pastor Harris was doing just that. Pastor Harris looked at both of them, his expression softening. "I spent so long hiding from this truth," he admitted, "but I can't hide anymore. I can't continue pushing you both away. You're my sons. I love you, and no matter what, I will always love you." For the first time, the weight of their family's struggles felt like it was finally being shared, finally being acknowledged. It was as if the burden that had been passed down through the generations was slowly being lifted, one painful truth at a time. And in that moment, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. Together, they would navigate this new reality, one step at a time, breaking free from the shadows of the past and building a future that was truly their own. Jake looked at his father, then at Luke, and for the first time, he felt a true sense of connection, a sense of hope. "We'll be okay," Jake said quietly. "We can work through this. Together." And in that moment, they all knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for their family, one built on understanding, love, and the courage to face the truths they had been hiding for so long.